I think we'll probably get going then. Hi everyone, I'd love to see you again for this event in our Encode Tezos series. I know a lot of you have been along for the ride so far and seen last few events have been quite technical, which is great. Today we're gonna still technical, different sort of technical. We're gonna look into all things UX and on that side, particularly if you're a front-end developer, this will be, I think, particularly useful to you. This event is part of our broader Encode Tezos series, in which we are trying to give you all the tools to get involved in the Tezos ecosystem, whether you're technical or non-technical. We've tried to make the events fairly accessible, at least something for everyone in this event series. Shortly, we'll be announcing the hackathon, which will be stage 2 of this program, stage 3 being an accelerator for the best teams in the hackathon. Today, we're delighted to have Anita and Dani back with us to give this talk today. So Anita, I hand over to you, and we're delighted to have you. And a last word just for participants, if you want to ask any questions, please drop them into chat and we will get to them throughout the course of the event. This event is recorded and will go up tomorrow alongside the slides for your enjoyment and for look back on all the great things. So Anita, thank you very much, and handing over to you.
Cool, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Anita. I'm the designer at TC Connect, which I guess you guys know already, most of you probably from this series. And also you must know Dani, but if you want to introduce yourself, go ahead.
Okay, so I have introduced myself before. I've done the dApp smart contract development and the technical introduction to Tezos partially together with John. I work as a blockchain expert and like smart contract architect here at TC Connect, and I'm here to add a few viewpoints and observations in this meeting. But like Anita is the one who's doing the main UX part.
Yes. So with that, I will just share my screen and we'll get started with the presentation. Okay. So this presentation is broken up into 2 sections. So first of all, we'll have UX principles, which is not Web3 specific, but just going through kind of like the different pillars of what goes into UX for applications. That includes user goals, user flows, interface design, and UX copywriting. And then from there, we'll move into designing dApps specifically and looking at kind of what we can take from general UX practices into Web3 and also any specific considerations and differences based on like how things have been practiced in the past. So we'll start with the UX principles. So first of all, I just want to say that this is kind of developed assuming that like most people here are developers or not necessarily designers or have much design experience. But I do, however, think that everybody who's involved in making any type of application specifically for Web3 or open source context has, the more ownership they have over the design of the product, the better. I think that kind of puts people's skin in the game, and everyone has the power to kind of think through these design questions and contribute to them. So yeah, this is an invitation to do that. And I guess the most important thing that I want to say about design is that I want to kick it off with the thought that the interface design is actually pretty powerful. And so it's actually like super important to think of throughout the whole development process of an application. So an interface, before an interface, it's basically like a blank canvas, right? And once you start having an interface, you start defining the options that people have, and also kind of their imagined possibility space for what they can do. Interfaces also can encourage specific actions, depending on kind of how things are framed and emphasized. And so it's important to recognize that power of design, because basically, if you're not mindful of it, you can lead to kind of what we know as dark patterns, or kind of leading people into certain behaviors that you didn't intend to, or that might not be healthy for them or wider society. So yeah, it can be a weighty thing, but that's exciting also. So I also want to emphasize, like maybe it's clear already, but design as a method over aesthetics I think a lot of times people obviously think of design as kind of the, like, what color should this button be stage of the development process. But I actually think that's like the very last and least important thing for sure. As long as it's an accessible color contrast, then we're good. But basically, like, I know Dani in previous presentations has talked about kind of designing smart contracts and designing dApps like from the kind of abstracted point of view. And I really want to tie this presentation and that approach into UX design and also interface design. So yeah. And also one specific caveat, I know this is named UX design, UX practices for dApps, and generally I will continue to use the word UX, but it's really interesting to think of the fact that think of things beyond the scope of the individual user and the implications that that might have. We've seen that as a huge issue with Web 2 in the past 5+ years, how an emphasis on a smooth and fun user experience can lead to broader societal issues. And so it's really interesting to think actually in terms of a more holistic systems design and how what we're building may encourage certain behaviors or interact with existing systems and wider implications beyond just thinking of them as externalities or oops, or at least our users are happy. Yeah, so with that, I will move to the first section, which is user goals. So user goals basically, I think, is like the foundational, like identifying the user goals is the foundational step in when you're developing an application, whether it's a dApp or standard application. And basically it's thinking like, it's essentially finding the problem before you find a solution. So a good way to approach user goals is the jobs to be done framework. I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with that, but essentially it's identifying what someone actually wants to do in their life, independent of the app that you're developing or anything, and trying to find solutions for that before jumping to something like, oh, this would be cool right away. So it's just a framework for kind of like thinking through that. And generally you would frame it as when situation, I want to task so I can expected outcome. So an example is, that's like a popular example, but you know, like we might be like, oh, I have a hardware store and I want to sell like a drill. Yeah, like we should put the drills like by the checkout so it's easy to find or something. But actually that's from the shopkeeper's perspective and from the user's perspective. They are like, when I have a painting, I want to drill a hole in my wall so I can hang the painting up. And that's how they end up going to interface with what you're offering. So taking that kind of like bird's eye view on kind of like what problem you're trying to solve and structuring it like this is nice because it centers the app development process around the extrinsic end goal instead of kind of having this kind of like closed, gated, what is this imagined need that we're solving. It also breaks apart the problem space and the solution space. So it's just helpful because through this, you might realize like, oh, it wasn't the solution that was wrong for the problem. It was the problem that was wrong to begin with. And so it starts kind of like just breaking down the kind of brainstorming basically of what you're doing. And then like through that, it helps verify or validate different levels of assumptions. Like, are we making assumptions on the problem level or the solution level or the expected outcome level? And also, I think this is nice. I mean, I think like I don't mention personas in this presentation at all, but I think that this can be complementary to that. And in ways I prefer this because it's actually related to activities, and multiple types of users might have the same job to be done at different times, and different users can have multiple jobs. So all that to say, jobs to be done, try it out. So yeah, then so kind of once you identify these like top level, like what's the problem we're trying to solve and what are the, oh, light went off, and what solution are we offering, then you start breaking down into, okay, so like, let's figure out the flows of how a user actually does this on our application. So user flows are super useful for this. Just essentially, they are diagrams of decision-making processes and actions that user takes to complete a task. And they're helpful mostly because it gets you thinking through like all the like, okay, what happens when this happened in this case, and everything, before you start getting to like the screen designing or the building. And it's kind of like the more that you separate this out from that process, it's just easier to compartmentalize the problem solving. So, you know, if you're already like trying to build something and then you realize that you have an issue in the user flow and you already built it, it's just like way more expensive to kind of address that issue then. So yeah, it's nice to think through as you're kind of like identified the problems that you're trying to solve and then going through the potential solutions. So it also like just serves as a source of truth for future designs and development work and helps promote efficient flows. So basically like how I would suggest going about this is brainstorm. So you have your problem from the jobs to be done. You brainstorm specific features that might support a solution to that problem. And then identify just like, okay, what screens do we need in the app? Like what are decision points that we would need and what are actions the user would have to take where, and start mapping it out. There's free templates for this, like that you can just find, like I think Miro has one, for example. And then just in these flows, just include notes on key information of what information needs to be presented to a user when. It's easiest to start with ideal scenarios and then kind of like expand out to the edge cases or the failure flows once you kind of have like the skeleton of that. It's important to think about in this context or in this process, the contextual considerations. So for example, there might be flow changes depending on different conditions, like if a user is logged in or not. Say you're trying to buy an NFT and you haven't connected your wallet yet, you can make the ideal case that, okay, the person has already connected their wallet, but you also in this moment have an opportunity to think like, okay, how do we present that information? Do we have an alternate flow path to connect the wallet and come back, for example? And yeah, it's also important to think about, especially in Web3, considering different levels of user familiarity with the app or technology. So we'll talk about it in more detail, and I'm sure you know, but there's a broad range of people's level of familiarity with this technology. And as you're building a dApp, it's important you have kind of this parallel education process that's happening as well. Also, it's important here to think about the ethical considerations. So this ties back to kind of what I was first saying as like design is power and making sure that like you are ethical with that power. But basically just making sure that you are being clear to the user what is happening in each flow, what they can expect, what the implications are for things, providing an opportunity to exit flows. So for example, like there's times in checkout flows, for example, where applications will hide a navigation bar and make it just really hard to go back. And that's, again, like what I mentioned, like a dark pattern. So you always kind of want people to feel like they're fully informed and also are always in control of their decisions and are not being pressured in one way or the other. Also using friction as a tool is really important. We've talked, I mean, the general discourse in UX around friction, like used to be like, oh, we want like frictionless, fun, smooth design, which of course, like there is value in having frictionless design in specific contexts, but there are moments where friction is really important as a moment of pause or a are you sure moment. And the friction doesn't have to be ugly or difficult, but through design, you can kind of make sure that you're guiding your user to really take actions that they really mean and actions that they're aware of what's happening. For example, I think Robinhood is a recent example of an application that was known for being like inappropriately frictionless, let's say. So yeah, it's just an example of how like a frictionless, smooth experience is not always the best thing. And this is something that you can start thinking of in the user flow stage. So after kind of identifying the user goals and the user flows is when you would come to interface design, which I think is what most people start thinking of when they think of UX, but it's really important to think of the different stages before that. So basically what's important about the interface, again, is not just the aesthetics, but basically it has a specific role in that it presents the space and its possibilities and also enables the user to interact with that application. So in terms of presenting the space and its possibilities, what's really important there and to think about how to kind of like concretely measure is your user interface working is looking at the information architecture. Is the content, first of all, present, clear, well presented, and also do you use like hierarchy to kind of make it digestible as well. So I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with Gestalt principles, but it's basically like visual guidelines on how to kind of group different types of information. So like using the same size or color or proximity for things can either separate or distinguish them. And you can use these specific kind of theories to your advantage when you're designing an interface. And then also the interface enables the user to interact with the app. So here you want to make sure you're looking at access or usability. So that's just broadly how easy a system is to use. Just minimizing like points of confusion, like, wait, does this button that says okay mean that I'm done and I want to close this, or I want to like process this transaction or something, like just things like that, like minimizing confusion. And also accessibility, how available the content is regardless of user ability or device or context. So that, for example, is making sure buttons are big enough, specifically, for example, on mobile devices where someone might be using their thumb, and you want the touch area to be big enough that they don't accidentally press something else. Also using like ARIA labels and stuff like that in your front end, and semantic HTML. And also minimizing cognitive load. So basically, this is just about like taking advantage of UI patterns so that you're kind of decreasing like the little effort that the user's brain has to go through to kind of make sense of what's going on. So this would mean just using the same drop-down pattern everywhere across your app, and things like that, so that you just minimize this kind of subconscious resistance and people's brain power can focus on what they're trying to do and accomplish.
We have a few questions.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So the first one is someone who would love to know how best to account for the state of blockchain when designing great UX.
That's part 2. So
okay, so we will get there.
Yeah.
Do you have examples of great UX in crypto?
I didn't include specific examples here, but when we talk in the second section, I think we can talk through specific examples, potentially brainstorm, but this all comes in section 2. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, what do you think of wallet designs in crypto and Tezos?
Also, maybe we can do that in the Q&A also.
Okay. So
like I'll stick to the UX principles for now, and then like after, once we get to section 2, we can get into these questions, and if they're not covered, then we can discuss in Q&A.
Okay, so everyone, please post your questions, and I'm going to collect them, and in the end, we get back to the questions.
Cool. Okay, so yes, that was interface design. Then I would say, for interface design process recommendations, I would say first start out with quick sketches on paper. It's just easiest to just do that for initial ideation. It's really easy to just like throw something away if it's not working and like sketch out something else. And then I would suggest starting with your default cases, and maybe at this point you move to Figma or some application, and then test those things, user test with prototypes to just make sure, like validate your solutions. And then once you kind of have your solutions validated, then you can move to higher fidelity mockups, doing complete design systems, if that makes sense for you, and also doing the branding and aesthetic layer. Just a note on user testing, because I do think that it's really important and also doesn't have to be like a big dramatic thing. I think it's fast. Like, I think if you, often when you're designing an application, you kind of recognize like, okay, we're not sure about what solution we want to use here or here. I see pros and cons in this one. Just if you make a quick prototype, it can even be like paper screens, but just get a couple users, like ask their feedback on it, ask them to go through a specific task, and just guide it with open-ended questions. And yeah, I think like just be careful about like not asking leading questions. Like if you have a preferred design, don't make it known. And also just be mindful of participant diversity as it relates to that specific flow that you're covering. So for example, if you're wondering kind of like which Connect wallet flow like makes the most sense, it's best to test it with someone who has no experience in Web3 and someone who has a lot of experience, and the range in between. And then lastly, for principles, something I think is really important and also kind of overlooked is UX copywriting. So this is kind of like a Venn diagram field of UX and copywriting, obviously. But basically it's looking at copywriting and the words that we put on our applications as being an essential part of the user experience and taking advantage of that. So I think like the maxim to keep in mind for this is that you keep your copy clear, concise, and useful. And basically what that means is to say the minimum of what is needed for that user, be clear, and basically pare it down to the essentials. So like have like simple language, bold statements, front-loaded sentences so the user doesn't have to get to like line 2 to get what you're talking about. If you need supporting details, keep it lightweight and then kind of link out for further information. And also just kind of using familiar words and yeah, just conversational language. Okay, just a note before we get to designing dApps on UX copywriting. I think that's a super important part. Like when we get into dApps, like there's, like I mentioned, like there's so much education that comes along with people using dApps and like being introduced to Web3 that, yeah, it's just an important part of that process.
Yeah.
Okay, so an introduction to designing dApps. So just a quick note about kind of like the state of UX in Web3. So it's definitely still nascent in both implementation and practice, which I personally think is really exciting and interesting. I think that in Web 2, we have like a lot of things that feel like solutions, like problems that have already been solved. And it's really just about kind of like applications in specific places. Web 3 is not so much like that. And so you end up seeing like a much bigger range. And also like, because there's less resources to pull from, I think that like you see a lot more kind of people's personalities in their like interpretations or like kind of how they built things. So this definitely has its pros and cons. I think cons, it can be hard to find resources, or, you know, you feel like you have to reinvent the wheel when you're doing these things. But as a pro, I think like there's that kind of creative spirit of Web3 and non-streamlined and deliberately not that way. And I think like, for example, from the Tezos ecosystem, Hicket Nunc was like the biggest NFT platform in the past year on Tezos. And that UX technically, it was interesting because it wasn't like good in the Web 2 way in terms of things were not very discoverable. You kind of had to like learn by doing. It was like kind of, the language could be confusing to people when they first started using it. But actually like there was so much delight in kind of like the Web 1 spirit or Web 3 spirit of Hicket Nunc that users actually like really, I mean, I think it for sure contributed to the community that popped up around Hickenoock. And also I think like the fact that it wasn't so easy to kind of discover things, that element of chance that was still there, and also that not everything was like a social like follow and whatever aspect was interesting. So I definitely think like in this current moment with UX and Web3, we should in fact like, you know, we don't need to look to kind of like the state of UX and Web2 and try to mimic, but there's room for it to evolve into its own thing. Also, I want to note that there are, because the audience of Web3 kind of like changes so much, like just a few years ago, it was like much smaller, more technically focused. And now, like as we saw in the past year, for example, a lot of new people like that are not technical at all necessarily have become aware of it and engaged with it. And so that leads to shifting UX needs. I think a new audience that doesn't know much also has different needs than someone who, for example, is a blockchain developer already. So what we can pull from the Web2 context, I would say system design thinking, best practices that I kind of mentioned from the sub-processes, so user goals, flows, interfaces, and copywriting, and the evolutions of the like sub domains of design ethics, especially as it relates to accessibility and transparency, and the broader implications of design decisions. So specific things to consider in a Web3 context. So off-app interaction is an essential component to any dApp, which is distinct from Web2.
So like what would come under this is, for example, if we're talking about NFTs, those NFTs should be like accessible to be used in like third-party marketplaces. They should show up in the users' wallets and with like the images that one would expect them to show up with. So even though like the user is buying the NFT or utilizing it within your application, the NFT ultimately is an entity that's independent of your application, and that's probably the added value of an NFT compared to just a traditional virtual good within a closed virtual marketplace. And I think when people design for Web3, they are often like they often forget about this part. So like really what Web3 adds us compared to Web2 is a level of like sovereignty of people over the things they participate in. And that means that we need to prepare our systems to interact in a more open manner.
And building off of that, essentially, so you have like these specific aspects of Web3, as Dani mentioned, and also including wallets, etc. And also elevated stakes. Like I think something unique to this context is just being aware of in decentralized contexts, like there's no one to go to when things go wrong. And so just making sure that users have that education. Also with this current kind of set of users, and as kind of like the audience expands, decisions about how much to extract away from the technology versus like reveal about everything that's going on are kind of important considerations.
In a way, this can make or break your application's adoption on both sides, because if you're like too obscure and too like you're trying to simplify things too much, or you simplify things and neglect to inform people about what's happening under the hood, then technical people and people who come from like the Web3 world will be suspicious of your application, because oh, like what is happening there, what server is this talking to, who sees my keys, who sees my address, like, so it's if like that there's a very large sizable user base for whom these are very important things, especially since interacting in the Web3 world can cost money, and often quite a bit of money. And but also at the same time, if you make your application too technical and it's full of technical jargon and kind of expects familiarity with blockchain, then people who are new on boards, who are just heard about like NFTs or Web3, might come in and be intimidated and feel like they are not qualified to use this application. So it's always like a good, an important thing to balance these two things.
Yeah. And a final note from this side is just that the methods from Web 2, I think, don't port well to the current Web 3 context, just being development centric and also open source. This kind of like waterfall method of first we design and then we build, just it doesn't really work that way. And so there's room to kind of like take kind of the best practices about how we think about UX questions and then like integrate it into ongoing development processes. Okay, so yeah, some detail about the user types, which also Dani was just getting into. But essentially there's just this, I think is, I mean, it's going to be universal no matter what your application, what your dApp is. There's is the range of users that you expect in terms of the familiarity with Web3. So for example, like if you're doing like an NFT marketplace or something, you might expect like much more novices, like many more novices. Whereas if you're building like a DeFi application, you're likely gonna have more pros who know what they're doing and expect more control. So essentially, like, you know, some people are basically going to want to know the full information. Some people are going to want to have more guidance. Some people are going to kind of buck at the guidance and kind of either be kind of think that it's overboard or think that it's almost, yeah, kind of imposing. So I think like just being aware of, okay, which users are we really trying to get at here and what might they want is an important question. So like I mentioned, solutions would depend on your context, so your project and your target audience. And essentially, no matter what, you should be thinking about this meta level flow of how do I access information about how things are working across the dApp. So whether it's if I'm browsing or I'm in a specific other flow, or I choose to go to an FAQ page, just thinking about how you structure kind of like these information flows from like, oh, what does this tools tip say about like what a private key is to all the way to the repo. And I think personally, like if you want just like a baseline starting place, I think it's like just a good idea to put like essential information in the flow using technical language with tooltips, so like little things that you can click on that explain those things if people need it. And then further links to a separate FAQ page. So that way the information is there, not overbearing and not distracting from the flow, but help support people who might not know exactly what's going on. Okay, so moving to wallets. So wallets are the universal building block of dApps. There's a spectrum when you're building a dApp of how you want to handle it. I think you also could talk about that as well, but essentially you can have something as unguided and as agnostic as just like a beacon modal that you click connect wallet and this modal pops up and you know the user can just take it from there. It doesn't have any guidance in terms of like which one you should pick if you've never seen this before, not integrated with the interface of your, like not styled to be like feel like native to your app itself. Or you can have something that's a little more guided, like make something that is styled to feel like it's part of your interface and then includes like suggestions like, oh, if you're new to Web3, try Kukai, for example. And I think just being aware of this range and kind of matching what your goals are and your users' expectations are with, yeah, with the right solution is kind of like how you would go about that.
Yeah, also I would say that it's again about like responsibility, also for the users and for like the crypto community at large. So something I have seen a lot is that artists who are like doing some serious work on the blockchain, it's one of their main sources of income, and they are using relatively insecure wallets to mint their NFTs. And they are surprised when I asked them, like, why aren't you using a hardware wallet? Well, no one told me that I should be using one, and I feel that in a way, this should be seen as the application developer's responsibility, that we should, as designers, at least inform the users of the importance and the levels of risk that they are taking. So, for example, if someone as like a friend or coworker asks me, I will tell them that if you hold more than maybe $100 worth of value in a wallet, it has to be a hardware wallet. Not because there's such a incredibly high chance that a non-hardware wallet will be hacked, but because the fallout from it being hacked. So like for example, for an artist who does NFTs, their signing key is essentially their signature. It's so important to them, and even if they do not lose a lot of value, the fact of them having to change their own chain identity to a new key, and now that the old key is no longer them and the new key is them, but still like their old art is signed with the old key. So that creates a level of like it doesn't look good. It can be confusing. It can be a well, I wouldn't say a loss of face, but definitely like a break in their own chain life. And because of this, I think it's important to educate people, like what if you're now going with like the social wallet with Kukai, because that seems like the easiest way. Um, are you going to be will you want to be using this key, this identity for something else? What are your intentions with it? If your intentions are to have like these artworks be traded on Christie's in a year, then you might be you might want to go and buy a hardware wallet and just play around for now. So these things I think should in a way be incorporated in the design.
When it comes to how things are presented, how like once someone has connected the wallet has presented in the interface, just from building things and testing it ourselves, we just have some takeaways that I think might be useful. So number one, of course, naturally, like you would have a link in the nav bar to connect your wallet, but also consider like in other flows where that wallet connection would be needed and kind of how you kind of make that easy and clear. So obvious, but if you're on a page for an NFT, you don't have your wallet connected, how do you facilitate that? Like maybe you have a connect wallet button just like right under the price or something. And so that way the user knows like, okay, connect wallet and buy, and I can continue with this flow. Also, making the address and balance easily accessible. I think it's nice, for example, like if once the user has connected their wallet, you see the address and the balance like as a little chip in the navigation so they can always see. But it's always something that you want to make sure, like, is this me who's actually signed in? Like, is it the wallet that I expect it to be? And does the balance make sense? Is it going to cover like what I'm looking to do on this application? And so definitely in the navigation is the clearest way to do that. Otherwise you can have kind of like just the icon for the wallet and then a flyout that shows the information. But in our experience, that's been, people haven't always known to click on that and haven't expected that information to be there and haven't known where else to look. Also, it's always just important to make copying a wallet address easy. So an easy thing to do is just like click to copy or have a little clipboard icon that will copy the address or any other information you need. Just make it really easy. And what I mentioned before, like using technical language that is accurate with tooltips that kind of briefly explain, and then linking to FAQs for more details has just been a good practice as like a default. And then include a link to top up a balance if it's applicable, especially like on a testnet. If there's a faucet, it can just be really easy, and yeah, it can kind of help facilitate.
Do you have another slide about testnet and mainnet specifically? Okay, then I'll talk about that right now because it's something that I think is very important. You really don't want anyone to suddenly realize that they thought they were on testnet and they just burned like $1,000 on mainnet. So I would recommend for the application to very visibly showcase whether it's mainnet or testnet, maybe even have a different color scheme based on that. So maybe like so that that if someone's like a technical user and they are like experimenting, playing around on testnet, they will never be at risk of confusing the testnet side with the mainnet side, because that's just a really a really bad day for anyone.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Okay, so beyond wallets, you have like the blockchain interactions that happen on the application. Obviously, not all actions that a user takes on an application are blockchain interactions, but things to keep in mind with these, that they require the user to leave the app to validate the transaction. They have gas fees and also have longer wait times than the in-app transactions as it's processed. So just solutions for managing these things. Use directive UX copywriting. So just make sure that you are explaining to the user kind of what the current process is, like what the current stage is, and what to expect in the following one, especially if they're being directed off the application. Make descriptions clear and trustworthy, and explain load times and next steps and success messages. So for example, if something successfully went through, then they may not see that information immediately on the dApp, but they should know that they can expect to see, for example, something in their wallet within 30 seconds.
Yeah, and especially on blockchain, these wait times can be really long. So it can be like multiple minutes until something really happens. And we need to prepare the users for that and communicate that, because people are used to things happening immediately, like with using cloud applications. Like you write something into your cloud document and it's already saved. People have like been used to that. We're really being conditioned to treat everything that happens online in the computer as instantaneous. And the blockchain Web3 really breaks that mold, and we need to communicate this clearly, because otherwise people's first impression will be that something broke. And of course, since we're talking about money, that means they are going to panic. So
yeah, exactly. And also just if there are errors or anything, just also kind of like providing solutions and pathways forward instead of just like letting the panic ensue. And then also finally, I just wanted to give a note on designing for open source projects. So in general, I mean, I think if most of your developers, you're aware of kind of like the issue and fix mentality, or I have an itch and I want to scratch it, and so I will build this feature, which can work for certain contexts. But if we want to think about kind of like improving UX and dApps, then also I think we have to kind of open up this possibility for different user needs and feedback to be collected, synthesized, and then have like broader themes. Also our own issues with specific applications that we're working on being validated by other people as well. yeah, and just making it easy for non-technical users to give feedback. So for example, not just having like a GitHub issues that someone can contribute to, but a link to a type form or something on your website, or just like an email that someone can give feedback. And that kind of can help create a healthy pattern of UX iteration in your dApp. Also, I just have a resource link here. So in terms of like specific resources, we at TC Connect, we have a community space called DSpace. And so we started making this ongoing list of design resources. So here you can find templates, also kind of accessibility checklists and things like that to get you started. And yeah, this will be an ongoing list. So with that, we can move to Q&A unless you have anything before Q&A.
No, we can go on.
Okay, Q&A time.
Okay, so there was a little bit of a discussion on why semantic HTML is relevant for Web3.
Well, any type of, I mean, if you're doing a web application of any sort, like semantic HTML is just a component of accessibility, just so kind of information can be parsed. And for example, like a screen reader will know what to do with like certain text. If you know it's a button, then they can say that it's a button, for example. So things
Yeah,
like that.
so it's very like if we're going from an able-bodied perspective, then of course, you know, it's a website, we see what's going on, but we need to prepare for accessibility. We need to prepare for people with reduced sight who might be screen readers or assistive tools. There might be people who have like various cognitive disabilities that might prompt them to want to disable design as like CSS, so they can see the screen with the fonts that they choose and in a clear way that's clear for them. So semantic HTML really allows users to tailor the experience to their abilities and their needs. And if we do not use that, then essentially anyone who is not neurotypical, seeing and sometimes hearing individual will be closed out of the of using our application.
And I will also just add that Web3 and decentralization as a concept is like fundamentally empowering. But there's so much onboarding into that world that you can see that without deliberate effort, you can kind of just, it isn't necessarily so. So I think like the base technology provides that, but there's no tech solutionism in that. And we have to be deliberate about kind of what we make, kind of carrying forth those values.
And can you get into examples now? What are some great examples of UX?
Okay, so just like any UX in the Tezos ecosystem, or do we want to talk about wallet?
So the original question was great UX in crypto, but if you have a good experience from the Tezos ecosystem for great UX, I think that's also beneficial.
Okay, what I actually like have my eye on right now is Versum, which is a new NFT platform. And what I think is really interesting about the UX there is that it follows the spirit of Hic-et-Nunc, which I mentioned earlier, but which kind of had this kind of like Web1 kind of rogue element to it that people really gathered around. But at the same time, one of their values is good UX and being transparent kind of about their roadmap in that way. So for example, they have a lot of kind of options, like you can toggle on or off information about like pieces in a feed. And I just overall found it kind of pared down and kind of re-envisioning what apps can look like, but still accessible and easy to use. I don't know if you have any that you like in particular.
Well, not really. I mean, maybe like if, yeah, I guess I think the Uniswap V2 UI was very clear. and at the same time communicated everything that you needed to make a trade on Uniswap. I feel like with the V3 UI, they might have moved a bit toward like maybe too much information on screen, but still like it's I would say that the Uniswap app is really well designed. At least if you know like the fundamental concepts of DeFi and of like trading assets, then it is very self-explanatory and it's cognitively like well usable.
And how about wallet designs?
Well, so first of all, I think like if you want an easy, like smooth, frictionless user experience thing, then using Kukai and doing like a social wallet is like the simplest. I think like as we mentioned before, like there's trade-offs with that. So I don't know. I mean, it just depends on your goals and kind of like what you expect your audience to be and their needs.
Honestly, like in either like in the Tezos space or outside. So even if we're looking at stuff like MetaMask or similar, there is no one wallet that I can say that I'm happy with the UX of. Sometimes they oversimplify things and hide or make certain things very hard that should be easy. Sometimes they are just not clear enough. So I think if someone made a wallet with really good UX, that would probably be a big breakout success because the competition isn't that strong.
And also just to note, I mean, I do think it is like worthwhile to talk about like the wallet UX, but I think if you're designing a dApp that's not a wallet, it will definitely have to be aware that like people are going to use a range of wallets that are amazing in some ways, awful in others. And you just have to kind of just assume like on like whatever you have control over as the app creator, like then yeah, just kind of help the user out there and accommodate for those gaps.
What is typically wrong with Web3 and DeFi designs? Most common mistakes that everybody does.
Not being clear on what actually happens, or on the other side, being too verbose and too technical. Actually, I've seen a lot of the first, especially in like NFT spaces, where it's like you navigate to the website and it's unclear what is happening. Like, okay, so here's this NFT. So what smart contract is it recorded on? Which blockchain is it on? It doesn't tell you like really, really important information that, you know, if we're talking about spending like thousands of dollars on a digital artwork, you definitely want to know. Also like again with NFTs, like not being clear about the role of IPFS and the peculiarities of IPFS, which means that IPFS is not forever. If you own an NFT and it gets ejected from IPFS, maybe because you know the pinning service is not paid anymore, then your NFT will disappear. And the way you can protect against that is to download all the assets from IPFS and back them up. But the NFT platforms do not tell you this and do not give you a simple user experience for actually creating this backup. So I feel like often people try to streamline things, but they sidestep or lose sight of extremely important things that in that process.
I also think like I don't know, like the like actions on the blockchain have more weight than actions not on the blockchain. And I think that like there can be a lot of panic surrounding these actions, like watch out, warning, this is important, like don't mess this up or else. And it's like for users that I mean, it's not helpful. Let's just put it that way. It's just not helpful. It just makes you panic already. Like, wait, are we panicking now? And I just think that like, yeah, there are calmer ways to kind of like facilitate someone's interactions with the blockchain.
Yeah, I
So-
remember there was this computer game when I was a kid. It was like this space strategy game, and that I really remember because it was really funny that the in-game like assistant artificial intelligence would say something like, making a mistake at this point will doom you and your colonists to a certain death. And I feel like a lot of these blockchain applications act very similarly, like they like warning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Certain death. Yeah.
What do you recommend for wireframing and prototyping? I think I did share the design resources link in the chat, so I think most of it is there, but I share it again. And also, if anything else you want to add.
Figma. Definitely Figma is really, it makes prototyping also really easy. So if you just start like making screens, you just switch the tab and just can link a button to the next screen and have it all in one place. Also, you can access it via the browser, and so like multiple people can be working on it at the same time. There are also like design system templates to get you started. Like I think in the resources I linked a material design system. If you are familiar with Figma, I think that can be helpful just to do something quickly. It might be a bit like overkill if you aren't, like if you're a new person to Figma, just to try to figure out all that. But yeah, Figma for both.
We have one last question. What can you say any examples of good UI or UX for the async nature of blockchain?
Meaning like the lag times. So like,
I think so.
Yeah, I think so too.
I actually can't think of any off the top of my head.
Yeah,
Can you?
not really. It's
You guys can make it.
yeah, exactly.
Let's see from the hackathon. But no, there's no like sterling example that I have seen, unfortunately.
Okay, and we are out of questions. So if there is no one else who wants to ask, I've seen someone unmuted themselves for a second. Maybe there is a question spoken.
Any other questions, guys?
You have a lot of thank yous though. Very interesting and informative.
Oh,
Thank you
that's
for the
nice.
resourceful one. Providing another really good presentation. So I have a lot of good feedback.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Anita and Dani, for such a informative and in-depth presentation. I personally learned a lot from it, so I know that everyone else also did. So thank you very much for your time and all the effort that clearly went into a really good presentation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We will put the slides and the video up for this tomorrow morning. I believe next week we have another more kind of front-end focused event for kind of dApp development. So continuing on the same trend. In the meantime, guys, thank you very much. If you have any questions, please reach out to us on the Discord. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you next week, and have a wonderful evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks, guys.